Folks, welcome to our March conversations for healthy congregations, and I'm pleased to welcome Margaret Marcuson, who is joining us for today's conversation. It's spring break for many people, so I'm anticipating their thinking systems when they're on the beach somewhere or whatever is going on. Want to just raise up the ongoing attempt we're making to engage in conversation with leaders in the field of systems thinking, family systems thinking, particularly bone application too. And welcome to Margaret. Margaret is the author of a number of print materials, but she's also been a pioneer in online conversations around bone theory and application to faith community's life. She's the author of Leaders Who Last, a book I've used in my senior Master of Divinity class, and also Money in Your Ministry, and a number of other resources. So welcome, Margaret. And want to say up front, Lyle heard this earlier when we were having a conversation, but this is Margaret's birthday week. So you're welcome to listen to the pivotal things that are happening when you reach a certain stage in your maturity and your chronological age. So we're benefiting from that from Margaret.
Not to say a milestone year, let's say.
Pivotal, right? So I'm going to ask a few questions, and Margaret and I spoke earlier this week and talked about some things. But first, as I have been with all our guests or our conversation partners, I'm going to ask Margaret, what prompted you to begin to engage with systems thinking and bone theory? What was the prompt?
Well, I got engaged with bone theory because I was actually, to be perfectly honest, so angry with my husband for not getting himself together vocationally. So I read Harriet Lerner's book, The Dance of Anger, and I didn't get it. And then I read it again, and I thought, oh, I play a part in this. And that, putting those her ideas to work was transformative. And then I thought, I've heard about this rabbi who wrote this book, Generation to Generation. Maybe I should read that. And ended up studying in his program, and so that's really how it all started.
So really, unlike many clergy who kind of come to bone theory through congregational application, you actually started with family dynamics and the family you're incubating dynamics, and that relates to family of origin. And one of the things that I notice is that that's rare, Margaret, to start with your own family when you're a clergy person. So what's different about you that you would have started there?
Pain is a great motivator.
There you
And
go.
I know, my husband and I have talked about this, and and he knows I've shared this with others. And he would say he's a lot better off because of my engagement with bone theory and that I was able to get off his back.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me, I tell the story oftentimes about starting to study at the Bowen Center, and then Bob, my spouse, meeting me there and being totally bewildered. We were going to visit together with a coach. So he wanted to go to the bathroom. So I sent him down the hall, and those of you who've been to the Bowen Center know that there are not signs on the doors for the bathroom. There's just a circle and a square. And I realized that. I walked down the hall just to see how he was going back and forth, saying, what is going on here? So the mystery of Bowen thinking, Bowen theory, to those of us who are part of our family too. You've raised Harriet Lerner's name, and she, in some ways, popularized some of the pieces of systems thinking long before we had really an understanding of even Friedman or whatever. So it's interesting that you would name her, but she was extremely popular in the 80s with all the
and she has a new book called Why Can't You Apologize, I think, which is well worth reading. And there is, I'm trying to remember the name of the chapter. There's a chapter in there that I think all clergy could benefit from for when somebody comes to you with a criticism of, that you're surprised by. So
What a great suggestion. And I think that it's known, but maybe not widely, that Harriet was there at Menninger when Bowen was there. So there is that kind of that there she was there in that kind of formational time, even though Bowen left. So that left its mark at Menninger as well. So yeah, thank you for raising that resource because that's a really
Yeah.
accessible piece for folks that are not necessarily in family of origin
Yeah.
groups or whatever. Yeah. So what would you say has been the biggest impact on you as a result of thinking, uh, observing process and thinking systems?
Well, I would say that overall have less stress in my life. I have more energy, because I'm not trying to run around, taking care of everybody all the time. Um, I think there's more space in all of my relationships, and it made everything interesting to me in a different way. So it's affected how I parent, how I relate to my husband, my father, all of my ministry, on the good days, and how I look at the world and read the news.
Yeah, that's an interesting image of having more space. I think that's really helpful. Less stress. You're not taking so much responsibility on yourself. I talk about taking appropriate responsibility
Yes.
for things, not more than your share. So how do you keep the space for
It,
for
it's a practice. So I think of myself, so I'm a recovering overfunctioner with frequent relapses. So it's not, I don't know if I keep the space, but I notice more quickly when I'm, crowding in there where I shouldn't be. And I'm more able to recover and step back and say, oh, wait a minute, that really isn't mine to do or to worry about.
can you, can you give an example
Um,
for the conversation?
well, this is another one for my marriage. So it's like I used to say,
Did you get a written release from your spouse
yeah, yeah.
today?
He knows I've told these stories. We've talked about it. Yeah, do
Yeah.
have his permission. I try not to tell any stories about him that make him look bad, so they're all about, and that's really about me anyway and how I relate to him. Um, I used to always say, I would say to him, you got a belt? So if he hadn't put a belt on when he was going to work. Um, so I think I've gotten so I can let it go if he's not wearing a belt. So that's just one little example. But also, even in working, the pastors that I work with, I just have to work all the time to, just be clear about, there's a line between me and, anyone I'm working with. They got to figure it out. I've got some resources, but it's not my responsibility to make it work. That is really up to them. And it's better, this is what helps me. It's in everybody's best interest if I can stay on my side of the line. It's better for them and for me.
Was thinking about a recent interaction I had with a student here who'd had some health issues, and we negotiated a paper due at another time because he'd been in the hospital, and I just ran into him in the hall, and the due date was upon us. And I just said, just check in, how's the paper going? And he went, oh, I forgot. Can you tell me what size font and where I send the paper? And I just looked at him and said, it's in the syllabus. And he said, oh, well, can't you help me out? I said, it's in the syllabus. He goes, more stress, Dr. Ott. And I said, appropriate
Exactly.
responsibility.
Yes, like that.
You can
Yeah,
do it.
yeah,
You can
yeah.
do it. But I mean, keeping engaged with that and watching the frequent relapses with what you
Yeah, and
like that too. So does Lance Snyder
yeah,
likes
yeah, and
that
I'm also
phrase.
thinking of like I have appropriate responsibility, so I mean, you can step down from overfunctioning and go too far, you know.
Right, right. What do you think prompts the going too far the other way?
Well,
Do you
I
have
mean,
any ideas
overfunctioning
about
is
that?
anxiety driven, and so is underfunctioning. So I think, when our anxiety is, when we have that, not that we're not anxious, uh, uh, relatively non-anxious presence is the phrase, not non-anxious. So
Yeah, well, and that is a frequently
it
misunderstood
is. It
piece of,
is. So that is the
yeah.
least quoted word that Friedman ever wrote, relatively.
For, you mean
Himself.
himself, yet it's over,
Yeah, people
yeah.
quote the non-anxious. I mean, he would say this, the non-anxious presence. But it's, to be alive is to be anxious. So I think a lot of people think they've
Uh-huh.
failed if they're anxious. That's not failure. That's being human. Pay attention to it. You do what you can to regulate it. Um, and you try to make thoughtful choices about what is your responsibility and what isn't. You're never going to get it, 100% right. But if you're thinking about it, you will be more able to be appropriate in your taking of responsibility. Than it,
It's an interesting thing to emerge from, and this has theological implications
absolutely.
too. To some would equate anxiety with sin, some do. However, if you take a good dose of grace on it and see it as a sign about something to attend to rather than good or bad, right? It really does shift what you can do with the anxiety too. I do see a lot of clergy and to be clergies interpreting anxiety as bad and then trying to mask it, deny it, and then there's huge repercussions from that as well. So, what's your observation
Yeah,
about that?
I think that's right. I mean, it's tricky because in a way you got to fake it till you make it. You
Uh-huh.
sometimes you have to. It's just so tricky. So you have to act as if you are less anxious than you are, which is not the same as just, driving it underground. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was thinking about not
Yeah,
spilling it
exactly.
over.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
taking responsibility for it, and also not being afraid of it, because I think being afraid of it helps spill it
It
over.
does.
Or I I use the image of being an anxious absence, and so sometimes that's what we do in that process is we actually in our denial of it are actually more anxious and then don't connect at all with
Yeah.
what's going on. So it's tricky, and in an age when often anxiety is medicated, how to what I guess make best use of what it is as a prompt rather than something that needs to be
Yeah, that's right.
eliminated.
I mean, that is a kind of a spiritual practice of just noticing,
Yeah.
I notice I'm anxious. What are the best ways to manage it? Do I need to? I mean, I think sometimes you have to say, so if there's someone at church, for example, you're having a hard time with, and you see them at coffee hour and you want to avoid them, well, you lean into the anxiety and you just go shake their hand and say, good to see you today, without getting into the issues. You're just connecting. So you're anxious, but you're acting anyway, acting on principle in spite of your anxiety.
Yeah, I think about that. I had a conversation with one of my colleagues this week about, and a story I told him about not interacting with a person right away. Because I just said it. And he said, that's bad Christian behavior. I said, I'm not doing it forever. I am trying to get to the point where I can interact well and honestly. So leaning into, moving towards, I think Nikki Cremone often says you go towards the things
Right.
that frighten you. Um, and that involves those interactions with people who've been most critical when we're in ministry
Yeah.
situations
Yeah. And
too.
obviously the
Yeah.
family members that make us most anxious. I think over time with coaching, you figure out a strategy to connect with those people that raise your anxiety the most, and that's where the potential for growth is. And it's sort of good news, bad news,
I,
right?
Yeah, it really is. It's, and I do family of origin groups with our students for senior year. I think I've told you that before. And I talk about exactly what you're saying is, moving towards those places where there's cutoff and starting with little bits. But a lot of people will say, why would I do that? It takes so much time, it takes so much energy. And you kind of have to just say, um, my experience is, but it's up to you,
So,
really. Um, the pain is worth the effort to toward and to
Yeah,
get to
yeah, I
the
think
other
that's right. And
side of
just
it.
practically speaking, so those people are going to show up in another guise at church over and over, so the sooner you work on your twitchiness with people like that, the easier your ministry will be.
Yeah, it's interesting to that the motivations for clergy are ministry better or family. I mean, some folks will say that they want
Yeah,
family relationships
yeah,
to be better, and they see the over ministry relationships, and then they see that their kids are going to be uh, well impacted in some way.
yeah. Well, that's
Yeah.
what's great about this work
So
is that it affects everything, and it really makes everything. I say easier. I mean, it is easier. Maybe initially it's harder, and then it gets easier over time.
And I've often tried to, I'll both say that as kind of, you could say that's testimony, but also not be hooked into do it because it's good for you. Kind of, sort of be light about it and say it's really is your choice, but my experience has been this. And I didn't believe it at
Yeah.
first either, but for some reason I persevered. Um, I don't know. I think I tell people it's just plain old stubbornness. Nothing more than that. So, um, a couple of comments on mine, Margaret. Richard Speck talks about we practice being slightly
Slightly
less
less anxious. I
anxious.
like that.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, or a less anxious. And he also said, at our best, we choose not to react. Um, and then I think when we do, that also gives
When we
clues
when we do react.
too.
Y- Yes,
When we do
that's right.
react, yeah, and
Right.
how to,
Oh, there's something to
yeah,
pay attention to. Ooh, what's going on? I mean, I know when my overall anxiety goes up, then I do start to overfunction more. So if I'm wanting to um, solve other people's problems, or I heard Anne Lamott describe it once as classroom helper to the universe. So if I want to be classroom helper to the universe, like let's just slow down and pay attention. What is going on? I mean, this particular article, her son was learning to drive, so it just spilled over into everything.
I love that image too. One of our online participants is laughing
Oh,
out loud,
yeah,
just so you
yeah,
know.
yes.
Well, yeah. So we were talking earlier about this being the birthday season this week, and so you're at this transition point, another decade. I won't say which.
It's okay.
And
It's okay.
so,
It's okay. I gotta, name it, gotta
Sally,
claim it.
there you go. So as you're at this vantage point, is there some new observations that you have, um, looking back, looking forward, whatever?
Well, let's see. And I guess so I've been working on this stuff um, for close to 25 years. And I'm trying to remember. I read, I was either 35 or 36 when I read that book, The Dance of Anger. Um, so new insights. I mean, I think I just keep moving along with it, and I find, um, a mentor of mine, Larry Matthews, says his observation was it takes people about 4 years to really start thinking systems. Um, and um, so, I mean, I would say absolutely it has been worth the work. I've been thinking, so my father is about to be 94. And, um, when I started way back when with Harriet Lerner and being mad at my husband, and I realized, oh, maybe I should connect with my father in a different way. And, it's taken a lot of years, and he's got some dementia now. But there's just a sweetness about our relationship that if without all the other benefits that I think I've gotten, it would have been worth it just for that.
I think that that primary triangle stuff is so important, and that would have been for me. The relationship with my father was the most twitchy for me, and it was the one I was most afraid of to work on, and had to have somebody just get in my face about it in coaching from this standpoint. But 2 years ago, my dad died, and I have no regrets, and partly it's because of this work, and we were able to connect, and I knew him much better than I ever thought I would by the time he died. And I think about the being able to see the humanity in our parents, and that they did the best that they could
Yeah,
for
they
what.
did the best they could. Yeah, and there's just so
Yeah,
much grace in that. And then occasionally I'll get caught up in it again, and oh, he's impossible. It's like, oh,
well, of course.
yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right. Well, what is Friedman? Another Friedman line said the problem with parents is they had parents. And that one line is a great gift. So, and
it's
the
great.
problem with everybody in your congregation is they had parents, and the parents had parents, and that also helps.
That's right. And Ed Henley, who's a person who's been involved, actually, you may have known him from the Friedman
Oh,
days,
yes,
but
yes.
he talks about people are people. It's just, this is the way people are. Yeah. So how to look at that with a good bit of
Yeah,
likeness and,
yeah.
and
Instead of
humor.
why are they the way they are? That's not productive. It really doesn't get you anywhere. You know, we get caught up in it. But.
Right. So you'd mentioned it was 10 years ago that Leaders Who Last, you published
It's
that. Is that
eight.
correct?
I started. I
So,
think I was
yeah,
writing. Yeah, I remember like turning 50, and I think I had just started it.
so that decade of, you're talking about doing this for 25 years, and 4 years you start thinking systems, maybe. Then you make a commitment not to lose it, I suppose, right? So was there something in this last 10 years from book to book, I don't know, or that was unique or pivotal for you?
Well, I really, I did start thinking about money. So I was thinking back, I'd forgotten this. I can remember having a fight with my father about money. This was in like,
Mm.
25 years ago, 20, a little bit less. Picking up Harriet Lerner's book, I wrote him a really angry letter, and then I didn't send it. And so then I picked up her book and I found an example of another letter. So I just kind of copied that letter and I sent it to my dad. I mean, did not copy it, but and
Yeah, use it as
used
a
it as an
phrase.
example. And the next time we visited, we had a very important conversation about a family tragedy. Um, that
Mm.
was a huge, huge shift. Anyway, so the last 10 years, so after I wrote Leaders Who Last, I thought it's like money is still, I wrote money in your ministry a lot for me to help myself get freer, and I figured it would be a contribution to others because I know most of us are not very free around money, and clergy in particular, it's a tough topic for us. And even since I wrote the book, I think that has continued to, I've just been on this quest for freedom in that, intense area of life. I think it's because it's related to survival, and so we just get so hooked in by it.
And related to
Oh,
multi-generational stuff, is that what
absolutely,
you're saying?
yes, yes, yeah,
You
yeah.
that somehow that loops back to dad and I
Yes,
guess mother.
in fact, my brother, I can't remember if I mentioned this the other day, I think I did. My brother is doing more research on our family and just finding out more and more about the scarcity that they experienced, 4 or 5 generations ago, and
Yeah.
it just, feeds down the generations. So,
Yeah. That stuff that we inherit that we don't know about is fascinating. It just kind of pops up, whether it's about money, and certainly congregations have the history of how money is managed, as well as the history of the person who serves in ministry leadership too, and going like this. And we're often avoiding dealing with the undertow of what money represents, because it's the money's not
Money
the
is not
issue
the issue.
usually.
No. No.
And how to get communities well, as we think about things in that way and kind of seed that thinking into a community, what happens in their attitude
Yeah.
towards money.
Yeah, without taking too much responsibility for any particular outcome. Just trusting that as we, work on our own differentiation in these different areas, that that's a contribution. But
One of the things that's included in the Healthy Congregations curriculum is a money
yeah,
autobiography,
I think
and
that's really valuable exercise.
it's the kind of feedback that we get about introducing that, people using it's been really strong too. So yeah, I know you know this because you do a lot of work with coaching individuals and working in communities of faith, but there's a lot of emotional process surfacing in churches now.
Right.
Yeah. So what do you see from church leaders? What are the responses, and where are the reactivities, and where do you see maturity developing?
Well, I mean, I think, what I see is that, as you might predict, it expands the spectrum. Some clergy are angry, some are very anxious, some are trying to be thoughtful. Um, they're dealing with divides in their own congregation. I mean, I think it just raises this issue of how do we deal with difference? This is the human challenge. And I just wanted to share with you something that one pastor shared with me. I mean, he told me about it, and then I asked him to write it down. So I just want to read a little bit about what he said. So in his church, this happened to be a Moravian church in central Pennsylvania, and this is Jeff Coppage is his name. And they did a class before the election. And the goal of it was to address the election season from a faith perspective that deepens our support for one another, even when we know that we are voting for opposing candidates. I remind us weekly that our commitment to one another's welfare as brothers and sisters in Christ far surpasses our political affiliations. Each week, a church member shares a bit of their story about their life as citizens and followers of Christ. We heard from a German immigrant. We heard a Vietnam vet share, a scientist who worked for NIH, an engineer as a district school board chair, a civil servant with state government. Each class has provoked more free-flowing discussion and questions for the week's leader than any class I've been a part of here. We close each class with a prayer for the speaker, our community, and our nation. And that is one of the most amazing things that I've ever heard about congregational life. Now, in these times, to be able to engage like that across the spectrum feels like a miracle.
Yeah, part of me thinks that what contributes to that is being able to think ahead, being able to not be afraid of the emotional process, but to set framework in place that makes sense of the disciplines that are part of the church, but also to see. I've just visited with a congregation that has developed a covenant around how they'll behave. They come up with a criteria themselves, and they've been able to engage in a whole lot more stuff that is charged than they were before, because they have set this in place. So, I mean, it was brilliant to do something before the election. How to anticipate but not take on too much responsibility.
Right. So it's a challenge. I mean, I know the church that I belong to has a range. Oh, and just one little story about my dad. So, my parents attended this church that was pretty conservative, and he developed a secret sign. So he would say to my mother, here, so they were these people are Democrats, everybody else is Republicans. They're Democrats like we are, but it's kind of secret. So I think there are churches where that goes, like there's secret, conservatives and secret liberals in most congregations, whatever the, the dominant theme is.
So how to not herd, I mean, think about the dynamics of needing others that are
Yes.
like us is so powerful. And I mean, it goes, I think, to what you were talking about earlier, as you go towards the things that are more uncomfortable. But it takes a good bit of stuff.
It does.
To,
It does. And I'll acknowledge avoiding these conversations myself. It's like they're really hard.
I guess I hear it a lot in
Yeah.
families, in particular, where there's a lot of difference in families, and they just
Oh.
avoid the
Well,
conversation.
I was also thinking about, Ron Richardson's book Polarization and the Healthier Church, where he talks about just inquiring of people how they came to their point of view. And I've thought about it a lot in terms of, pastors trying to lead towards something that somebody doesn't want, and inquire, not trying to willfully
Yeah.
impose your view on them, but I think it really applies here as well. Where it's like, not how can they think that way? Or, I'm going to try to convince you that my way is the right way, but just to be intensely curious, that would be a different kind of engagement.
And to stay in with the curiosity, even when you get the push from the other side, like trying to make
Exactly.
me change my.
Yes.
We had a faculty meeting a couple weeks ago where someone in the group raised an issue. It was a really hot button issue, and wanted to do something. And I had the presence of mind to say, can you tell me your thinking about why you're going? And it really did make a difference. Instead of my saying my opinion first, to hear, and then we engaged in what would be honest reflection about what would be a good choice, but that the choice wasn't on the to do something, wasn't on the rest of us. It was on the person who raised the issue. So think about, what does it take to come to the kind of experience that you're describing from Eastern Pennsylvania?
Yeah, central. Yeah.
Yes,
No.
Pennsylvania. So I think that the theory would say we work on practicing it ourselves and introduce as best we can some creative processes to experiment in the communities we're a
I
part
think
of.
the experiment is a great way to think about it. But I think, you could start tomorrow by learning to listen better. We always, we talk to people every day, and we're not very good listeners. I took this workshop a few years ago where, there was a segment on listening, and we had to go home and do listening homework. And so I had to listen to my husband for 3 minutes. And afterwards, I said, I just realized I don't listen to you very well. And he said, I know. So that was like a moment of truth. I'm always, thinking about what I'm going to say or what I'm going to do next. And, we've been married for a really long time. So I'm better now, a little bit better.
We actually, in our marriage, we have a code we use. Do you want me to respond? 2, do you want me to just listen? Do you want me to help you sort it out? So, I mean, there's numbers associated with it. It's interesting, part of what I've been doing in seminary classes is introducing people to, when we're doing pastoral care processes and stuff, is for people to be given a certain amount of time, and the people they're with cannot respond at all. It's not unlike what happens in a coaching group. And no questions, no responses or anything. They just have to sit. And it's very uncomfortable. And I try to introduce it by saying this is not going to be easy because you're being, in some ways, trained to have answers. So can we just concentrate on letting people think for themselves? It's a really interesting, again, experiment to see how people react and whether or not they can build capacity to listen, which is
Yeah,
what you're
yeah.
talking
And
about.
I've done some of this in some workshops, where I just have people, one person talks for 2 minutes and the other person listens, and then they switch. And it's, the responses vary from, it's really very hard to listen and um, not jump in with advice or help. And sometimes the person who's being listened to said, no one ever listens to me like this. No, this is for 2 minutes only.
Yeah, I mean, that's a drop in the bucket, but it feels like forever. So, yeah. So it's an interesting challenge is to work on our own
Yeah.
capacities to listen and model. Well, I hate to use the word
To
model, but
be
to
it,
be
yeah.
it.
And that
Um,
it requires self-regulation, you know.
yeah.
And as you say, we're not trained that way, and it feels like, if we're not, in a pastoral care situation, for example, if we're not giving advice, then, we feel like either we're not doing our job or they think we're not doing our job. There's a lot of pressure.
Although I have to say, I've had so many people say, "Thank you just for listening to me." Yeah, yeah, well, it's just
Yeah.
what's there. And so there is that awareness, I think, um, that it really it strikes a chord that there's not enough of
Yep.
it going on. And I think this relates to the political situation too, and just thinking about how to get a handle on what's happening nationally and
Yeah.
internationally without I mean, listen to the broader scope of what is going on.
Yeah.
Uh, Gail Zackerson says online, she said she thinks it's the Mennonites, actually, and maybe the Quakers too, who, when a group is in conflict, after a statement is made, there's a waiting period of a minute before anyone
So great.
responds.
That would be easily, or maybe not so easily, but that could, you could do that in a family. You could do it in any church.
Really, to be an interesting, again, experiment to see if that would be part of a
Yeah.
covenant, is to, whenever things get hot, to say, "This is let's
Try
let's
this.
try this."
It's an experiment.
Yes,
We'll just try it out.
yeah,
If it doesn't work, we
right,
can go back.
yeah. So your example from this pastor, what was going on? So you're seeing um, really examples of leadership showing maturity throughout the denominations, throughout the churches. Is really what you're saying.
Yeah, and I've also been in meetings, here in Portland, which is, of course, a hotbed of, progressive thinking, and been in meetings with very reactive clergy in the last few months. So, um, so kind of, there's a spectrum.
Well, and I think about the West Coast as being a place where connection to faith communities is not as strong as in other parts of the country too. So it's an interesting place to observe what there is reactivity to and about. Do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts about
well,
that?
and I think in all the states. So I think this is true. Um, if you look, I mean, I'm sure there's no community that was. I don't mean I don't even know this for a fact. Obviously, no state was carried 100% by either candidate. So there are supporters of both candidates in every single state in the United States. So,
Right.
and whatever the dominant group is, their voice is louder, and other people stay quiet.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but go back to the fusion issue, the need for others who are like me and what it takes to engage. And so if you have uh, polarization in every state, regardless of the progressiveness or whatever, there's something that needs to be
Right.
listened to.
Yes.
I found it interesting in Ron's book on polarization that he used the example of something that happened quite a long time ago
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
case study. Yeah. Um, but the processes stay over time. I've been thinking about that, and I happen to be from the town that he was in during that case study. Um, but the way he handled it is a template for
Yeah.
what you're talking about in
Yeah.
Pennsylvania or
Well, and there's
Portland or
another
whatever.
really interesting thing where he talks about in that case study where he, in one particular setting, he said that showing up was defining himself. That he didn't have enough of a relationship with them yet to define himself on the issue. He just was present with them, and that was kind of self-definition. So that's interesting.
That's really good point, and a powerful statement too about pastoral presence. That it's being there. It's not necessarily saying this is the way things are. It's about physical, fleshy, just hanging or whatever, just being present. And people can't hear you unless they're moving towards you. So I think about that relative to the kinds of, when I first started in ministry, I had a mentor who used to say, you have to pay the rent, Emlyn, which means visiting. At that time, that's what he was talking about, is making sure and that's true. That's about being present being there at the bedside when people are dying and all that sort of thing. That's presence too, that pays itself forward, if I put it that way, pays itself forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it builds relationships. No relationships, you know, no leadership, right? I mean,
Right.
you have to be clear
Right.
to know where you're going, but if the relationships aren't there, you're not going to be leading anybody anywhere. It's hard work.
I I had a student who just graduated who was here for something and had, like, I think 7 funerals in the first couple of months in their new setting. And they were just, kind of flattened by it. And what I said, which was my experience too, is, wow, what a great opportunity you have to get to know all those families in your first couple of months. Um, and it just fell in their lap. It's not something that was constructed at all. So, well, so what do you do to manage your own anxiety?
Well, so what I'm doing, now in terms of the political season is that what I'm
Yes.
really trying to do. So I'm trying. Actually, I sort of fell off the wagon this week. I'm trying not to read news online. I'm not clicking on links on Facebook. Um, so I am reading our local paper, which is not what it used to be, but there's some things there, and it helps me stay in touch locally. And I read The Economist, which is a weekly, so it's not a daily, it's not hourly, and it is an outside perspective. So and a global perspective, so it helps me keep the bigger picture. So and I get I just I was just so I'm reading 2 books that I wanted to mention as part of this process. So I've read one, and I'm rereading Friedman's A Failure of Nerve. You can see all my little post-its here, all my readings of it. I'm adding a lot more right now. I'm reading it devotionally, like 2 or 3 pages a day, and that is helping me think. And so just today, let's see, he was talking about parenting. Let's see. Um, I had this marked because I wanted to read it to you. Um, oh, the shift in parental focus from the child to their own self affects their stamina. For as long as a parent's focus is on the other, the unremitting lack of self-regulation in the troublesome child gives it a never-ending, relentless strength that is hard for parents to resist as long as they're trying to be empathic. Okay, so what you might say, I'm not, not even thinking about politicians. The unremitting lack of self-regulation in the news media gives it a
Mm.
never-ending, relentless strength. No, news media / social media. It's hard for people, individuals, to resist as long as they are trying to be informed, right? So
Yeah.
you have to set some boundaries. You have to make some choices.
I was recalling what happened following 9/11 when there was this constant loop, actually the same information over and over again, and people were entranced and just stuck at their television. And you're describing weaning yourself from that kind of unremitting attention to small details and also high anxiety.
Yeah, I'm looking for what will
Well,
help me think. So these anxiously posted links on Facebook will not help me think. Um, um, I find that watching television news doesn't help me think. Um, saying to my husband, "Did you see what's happening now?" That doesn't help me think.
you also said you do things kind of in a longer trajectory. You don't do the constant check-in, but you read something that's
Yeah,
about a week rather than the little, I'd say the minutia, but the
yeah,
little
yeah.
details
In a good,
along the
on a
way.
good, on a
So you
good
get that
week. Yes, I kind of
chance.
got seduced into
In a good
538
week.
again this week, and um, that's Nate Silver's site. So,
Yep.
so
Yep.
it's so I need to not do that. It's like I realized that's not so good.
And what you said, I think The Economist is um, singularly clear and fact-based
It
too,
is.
and
It is.
trajectory.
It is. It's
Yeah,
expensive, but I view it as an investment in my mental health.
yeah, yeah. So that's related to the political world, but you're saying also that just the discipline of finding things like that helps you manage your anxiety.
Say that again.
Finding something that gives you a broader
Yes.
view that helps
Yes.
you think,
Yes.
regardless whether it's about
Yes.
family or.
Yes.
So does music help you
It's mu-
think?
it must. I do. I mean, I sing every day. I take voice lessons and I practice, so I'm assuming that's doing something to my brain. And the other thing about singing is that it helps me helps me increase my repertoire. Because my teacher is always pushing me to um, basically to have more choices as a singer. She's pushing me to be more, free, more dramatic. Acting is, I'm a pretty good singer, but the acting part is not my greatest strength. So it just, I have to put myself out there and take risks. And what she
Mm.
said at my last lesson is that the other singers are noticing it's helping them step up because because
Because
of
you
what I'm
are.
doing. I hadn't thought about that till just this second. That that's a kind of leadership in the group. So because
It
we
really is.
perform for
It
each
really.
other every week. I mean, not every week, but every month, once a month.
So I have to admit to the folks that are online that I had insider information in asking that question
We've talked over
because
the years.
Margaret always talked about music all the time, so that's where that came from. But is there any other way that you
Well,
manage your anxiety?
exercise. Yeah, I find if I'm not getting exercise, that I get more anxious.
Yeah, so I mean, I think about this being spiritual
Yeah.
disciplines too, introducing things that help you think a little broadly or in different ways, experiencing something physical, and there's something integrative about music, particularly choral. not so much instrumental, because the words and the sound together, and then also what you have to do with your body and breathing and so on. It's a form of prayer, you could say.
And I do tell people, your breath is always available to you, in the worst meeting, if you just breathe, your brain will work better. I mean, you have to remember, which can be challenging.
It's really true. It's really true. So I mentioned in the introduction to you that your book, Leaders Who Last, has been used quite a bit in a variety of different settings. I mentioned I use it here at the seminary. But you also presume that lasting is a good thing. So, and I don't necessarily hear that so much from people, although I'm an advocate for it myself, and that comes out of my own experience. But what do you think it is about continuity and long-lasting relationships and experiences in ministry that's important? And so that would be the first question. What do you think?
Well, I think that, it depends, but generally I would say, if ministry is about relationships, then having longer term relationships is going to make for a more productive ministry, because you just, you know your people, they trust you, you can get away with things that, you couldn't get away with at, 4 or 5 years in. And, generally a longer term ministry is better. Now, I think on the, there are also times when clergy stay too long. There are times when people, some churches just don't have enough, there's not enough there's not enough depth and substance and health to really make it work. And just to hang in there and be a martyr is, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, I did have, one this last year, I've developed this Leaders Who Last, program with, weekly lessons. And one pastor, so one of the lessons was called Why You Should Spend More Time with the Healthiest People in Your Church, something like that. And so I got an email from a woman who said, and gave me permission to share with you, that she realized when she read that the 2 healthiest people had just died and there wasn't much left. And she got clear really fast after thinking about that it was time to go. So, that's the kind of the other side of it, to assess what's possible. But I do think that oftentimes clergy leave too soon. Things get hot, they get anxious, and they get their papers in order and go. Where if they could regulate themselves a little bit better and not blame everybody so much, they could write it out. I mean, it's like a marriage. I think sometimes people quit too soon, or sometimes their therapist gets so anxious that, they end up divorcing when, maybe they could have got through it.
So one of the ways that I understand it is that those are points of new clarification, that people look at it as, okay, I need to assess this, I need to look at my own responsibility. And I think you're absolutely right that there are some times when pastors leave too soon because they don't know how to handle the heat. And but also there are times when there's not much for the next phase of ministry, and it is appropriate and healthy.
That's the sermon, and I don't think there's a formula. And I think there are times when you could go either way. You could stay productively, you could go productively, and then you just discern, or maybe you just decide what you want to do. That's okay.
I have been working with a person for a number of years who was in their first ministry setting that's not been very productive, and he was really connected to the idea of staying longer than the usual first ministry setting. But he did some really good thinking and decided to accept another position, partly because of family. He looked at the whole sweep of things, and he's in another setting that's just great. But he had to really wrestle down the whole, I need to stay, I'm a good, loyal oldest son that takes care of things, and look at the whole
Yes.
sweep of things. And so being able to have good conversation partners with that aren't anxious
Right. Well,
also.
and one of the things that
Uh,
makes me crazy is that denominations send new clergy into these tiny sick churches because they have to fill them, and then they get beat up.
right.
And, you know,
Yep.
that's that's
Yeah.
not, I think it's an ethical problem.
Yeah. How to get at that? Whew. That means systems thinkers in leadership positions that make those kind of decisions too.
Yes.
So the impact
And
at
you know,
that level. But
those are hard choices at the denominational level too. But you know, but then new pastors, you kind of got your heroic mindset. I'm going to go in. I'm going to fix this thing. I'm going to make it grow. And,
yeah, I often say those are the places the most experienced
yeah,
people
yeah,
need to go to, but the most experienced people won't accept the
right.
pay that would be part of those settings too. So it's really a catch-22 unless there's massive
Yeah,
denominational
yeah, and I
attention.
don't mean to say anything about it's not about church size because there's some wonderful, healthy small churches that are a blessing.
Right, right.
There's some that they're small for a reason because nobody wants to go there because it's not fun. I mean, just as a member, why would you go to that church? Because they're fighting all the time.
Yeah, yeah. Any other observations that you make? And you're saying something about how judicatories are set up with sending new pastors and so on. But are there any other things that you've noticed that are anxiety related in denominational
My-
or
These are anxious times for our institutions. I mean, I think any time that money and numbers are declining, it makes it hard to do
yeah,
creative thinking. And people are they're trying to reinvent themselves or try new things, but it is anxiety driven, it's survival driven, and so you're just not going to get the best stuff going on. Um, I think the more we can get ourselves into a place of possibility, of letting go. I mean, the the church is not going to go away, but it's not going to look the same. And so these the structures are going to evolve, and it's going to be difficult. Um, but if you say, well, what are 20 ways we could um, you know, be creative in this situation, or in the wider church, and just let people's thinking loose. Um,
yeah. Do you see that
not so
happening?
much. No.
And,
I mean, I think
yeah,
there are places
yeah.
where it is happening, but uh,
And a micro
yeah, at a
though,
micro
not
level,
on no.
I think I think the energy. I mean, in
Yeah,
institutional life, no matter where you look at it, the energy is always at the edges. I mean
yeah.
that's how organisms grow too. So
Yeah, I was thinking about how, because what my own observation is the best change happens when relationships are maintained and that there's some conservation and
right,
some progression,
right. So
but
you're not. So
not
it's just as
just when
reactive to throw everything out.
right. Yeah. So that takes a good bit of staying power. And, like we were talking earlier about moving towards things that are really uncomfortable too. But the whole throwing everything up for grabs, seeing what will result is
Yeah,
pretty
yeah, that's right. You say,
destructive.
well, we have these resources, we have these traditions. What are our best ideas on what's, given the past, what's next? It's like, that you're claiming your family story um, and building on it. You know,
Yeah.
one of my favorite stories saw in a little quote really it's an article in Travel and Leisure magazine about Hawaii. And there was a guy who's a clothing designer whose name is Sig Zane, and he said, none of us is the first one in Hawaii or anywhere really. We're just standing at the front of a really long line. So I've never forgotten that, and it makes me think of the great cloud of witnesses. And what can they do that, what can we do to, to keep the line going, and kind of
Yeah, it's
imagining
just
them, beaming at us, and cheering us on, and you know,
the other way I look at that too, Margaret, is to see our predecessors and our successors as we're serving, as we're all on the same staff. And so to acknowledge that like you get it's like a relay
yeah,
race. You get
exactly,
the
exactly.
baton,
I love that image. Yes, right. Yeah,
pass it on. And so then there's good, bad, and ugly that have happened
yeah,
with each
yeah.
ministry. And I always try to like I have apologized to my successor for the things done and left
Right,
undone, And,
yeah,
uh, we have a pretty good
yeah,
relationship. But to think of this as obviously she's caring for people that I love
yeah,
now.
yeah,
That's her job, and I'll do what I need to, you know, uh, support her, but not talk about anything
yeah,
related to what's
yeah,
going on there. So, it's a relay race, and we're all part of the team. So um, it's and the cloud of witnesses. That I think that's really powerful. That's a
it is.
multi-generational
Yeah,
thing too. Is good stuff, and to think about the strengths, not just
exactly,
what's been done
exactly.
poorly.
And I think that is important. And this is sort of related to a practice of mine that helps me, is uh, someone suggested, giving up complaining. So I've tried to take that on as a practice to not complain. So you can not complain about what people did in the past. You can not complain about what's going
Yeah.
on in the present, whether it's, in your backyard or in Washington, D.C. It doesn't get you anywhere. It just, reinforces negative thinking, doesn't produce creativity. And I have found, um, this is my second year working on it. I'm a lot happier. When I'm on an airplane, it says like, oh, try not to complain about the rigors of travel. It's like, I'm in a metal box. It's flying through the air thousands of miles. It's a miracle.
Yeah.
It has it
Yeah.
changes your
Yeah. That's
experience
great.
of travel.
I wrote down a couple things that you wrote. Giving up complaining. I'm going to think about that. I'm still in the middle of my
Uh-huh.
Lenten
Uh-huh.
disciplines, but the whole thing about claiming your family story and building from the best of it
Yeah.
around that. I just I found out, and some folks that are online have heard this story, but I found a cousin I didn't know about recently and made a visit. And this cousin has done a lot of research about our extended family going way back in Germany. And I found out that I come from a long line of entrepreneurs that have started businesses going back to the 17th century. And think about that as whoa, I mean, that's something that continues. What a great piece of
Yeah.
DNA it's my dad's family. So how to look for those kinds of treasures too when so you're in a congregation, in a family, consulting if anyone's doing it. It's just listening for those
Like
kinds of pieces is
what has
really,
worked and what is working now.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I know that you had a chance to look at our book of the year, What's God Got to Do with It? And so I don't know what your thinking is around theology and Bowen theory, but Ron in his article, and then also we talked last month, he takes a pretty clear view that theology is part of the belief system. That's part of maturity and understanding human life together. But I wonder how you put theology together in the work that you do in your own
Yeah, yeah, I
systems
thought
there.
about that, and I think my tendency over the years has been to think more about spiritual practice than about theology per se, and to come at it from that angle to
Uh-huh.
say, as I read about differentiation and work on it for myself, as I read about spirituality and about the great spiritual teachers, I mean, there's a lot of commonality, so, is differentiation of self and spiritual, are they the spiritual maturity and differentiation of self, are they identical? Are they parallel? Are they closely related? In a way, it doesn't matter because you can work on them. You can work on them both. I mean, I think, some kind of meditative practice is a great, it moves us in that direction. It helps us, biologically be less reactive, spiritually less reactive. Um, so that is, to look at just the classic spiritual disciplines and to, that it's just a practice. Because I think working on differentiation is a practice. And I think it is helping us be more of who God created us to be our best selves. And it takes years.
So I think about that relative to just doing it, being it, leading to the natural responses that make for a deeper experience of faith and a deeper experience of the world. I mean, I guess it's coming to more of what God intends for us too, in the practice of engaging in family work and being a better listener and an observer.
Well, and then I did love this line from Ron's essay. Thankfully, differentiation of self is not a condition for salvation. Like that would be works righteousness. Um, and I really think, that as clergy that we don't believe in grace really for ourselves. You know what I mean? It's like, in our heart of hearts, or maybe I should just speak for myself. I know there's part of me that just thinks that it all depends on what I produce, as a good oldest daughter. And, and that includes kind of getting an A on differentiation, It's like, well, which is impossible, so.
It's easy to turn this way of thinking, I think, into works righteousness. Or if I get it right, my family's going to be okay, or my church is going to be okay. And I think that Friedman application and Bowen theory can be interpreted that way. Anything can, from the right vessel, right?
That it's not about success. It's about growth. And you can always show up for growth no matter what, and that God accepts us no matter what. And God loves us no matter what. And we preach this, but can we claim it for ourselves? That's a spiritual process.
So I had a theology professor in seminary who said, preach to yourself always. Someone will be listening. Well, you hope. But I know I was drawn to Lutheran theology because of the emphasis on grace, because I have trouble with it. Knowing that I can think it, but living it. I guess it's the separation of those two things. And you're raising the whole embodied by the practices. The others, I think this is what I hear you saying, the other things emerge in engaging the practice, in the engaged relationship with God.
I think that's right. Well, and the other thing I'm thinking of, so not only do we put that pressure on ourselves, like there's this institutional pressure to say, okay, there's these huge forces at work in society. Here I am with my little or big church or whatever. It's really hard to make it work because it's just harder than it used to be. And yet I and others so desperately want me to succeed and, make it grow, make it work. All you can really do is just show up, you do the best you can, you keep learning, and trust God in the process.
Yeah. So then if Bowen analyzed religiosity as something that had a function for human beings, how do you make use of that view on religion and spirituality. They kind of, in some ways, I was just with a bunch of folks in Washington, and we were talking about Bowen's view on religion. And, the observation is very reactive, too. Just happen, that it's something that it would be akin to what other individual therapists would have called a crutch. So it was the function of religion, not the reality of what was at the basis of that impulse in people.
Yeah, well, I think both can be true. I think it does serve a function in human life. And, I'm a person of faith. I pray and read the Bible every day. And so, but I think the research shows, people who are connected to faith communities, do better over the course of their life. They live longer, they're more content. So that's functional.
And respond with resilience when there's been loss, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Results of the spiritual disciplines that are part.
And, if something has a function, it's not the same as saying it's a crutch.
But to say it's only a function.
Well, I don't believe that. I mean, this is my other favorite line from Ron's essay. Bowen systems theory does not address the ultimate questions about human life, the why questions. That's part of our job, is to address those questions, and they're really important ones, maybe now more than ever. I think in a time of heightened societal anxiety, that thoughtfully addressing those questions is a real contribution. Even if people aren't asking them because they're so focused on the moment and the latest news cycle, or what's going on at work.
So if at the heart of Bowen theory, Friedman application is asking questions to who, what, when, and where, which are more teaching people to be good observers and good listeners, then asking those questions prepares one to not be so reactive in acting the why questions.
And I think focusing on the big picture why questions as opposed to the really micro why. I mean, I think the micro why questions are a waste of time. Why is the matriarch in my church so controlling? That's not a useful question. Why did God put me on this planet, in this place? That's a useful question.
And not easily answered because it is not a one-to-one correlation.
Right. And so so the why. If your why question has an easy answer, don't waste your time. If it has a hard answer, it's worth your time. I don't know. I just thought that's the first time I thought about it that way. But
we're getting into an area we hadn't really talked about before, but I think this is really interesting. I just had a conversation with one of my colleagues who is very clear about call. I've been called to only do this, and I'm aware that that's what I need to do. And I said, I don't see call that way. I see it emerging in the midst of wherever you wind up being. And I think about that as, kind of the why question about why am I on this earth is not something that's answered until you look back and the rear view mirror to the whole trajectory, and that God engages us along the way. But I said, I have no idea exactly where God's calling me right now. But it's emerging. So, and we, in this tradition I'm a part of, this whole language of call is really strong.
Right.
I don't know what God's thinking. But apparently my colleague might.
I know. It's a challenge. I mean, my call is to help leaders grow. Mostly church leaders, but kind of wherever I'm showing up, that is how I sense my purpose to be. There's a million ways to work on that one.
Yeah, that's right. So I want to open things up because we So actually, I have something online, and then I want to invite any other questions or comments here. We've been getting just a few,
Okay.
Margaret, not many. So Bob Mathis says, I try to avoid all why questions. They seem to evoke defensiveness rather than deeper thinking.
Yeah, and maybe another way to think about it is, just to reflect on the question, what is my purpose? Yeah, maybe that's a better way
Yeah.
to phrase it.
I guess restate the question in a different way that is more evocative of thinking rather than, I think I've heard Bob say it encourages emotionality, asking why questions. I have to observe, I'm not, I don't know if that's
Yeah.
always true, but certainly it's the questions that are asked in theology classes, it's the questions. Another comment, in these days and years, the thought keeps crossing my mind that God is in the downsizing business. And there's only a remnant that gets it right, in quotes, that we finally get to be in ministry rather than just making ourselves comfortable and looking successful.
Yeah, well, I think that if you're not focusing on being, that the doing that you're doing will not have much depth. And I think it's also, if you're doing, it's very hard to sustain yourself over time. You just, the battery will
Right.
run down.
Other comments and questions from those of you who are with us on online? We have a group of folks that are obviously thinking and listening pretty intently, Margaret. Or is there anything else that you would want to
Um,
raise, Margaret? Yeah.
oh, well, just one other, I forgot to mention the other book that I read post-election. It was Margaret Wheatley, the systems thinker, Coming to Our Senses, Lost and Found in Our Brave New World. So it was published in 2012. It's probably more relevant than ever. And she talks about what she calls emergent forces in our world that we can't change no matter what. I mean, you can't change the fact that people are, more distracted by their devices. Can't change. There's this
Right.
global populism that is happening. Um, and so she, coming out of her study of Tibetan Buddhism, she talks about being a warrior, which she doesn't, by that she doesn't mean fighting, she means just having courage. And you show up, and I think this relates to Gail's comment. You show up and you do your work because it is yours to do, not because you expect any particular outcome. So that was
Nice. Very nice.
Um, that was useful to me. And she even has like a list of affirmations. I'm grateful to have something like I'm grateful to have found my right work and to have the opportunity to do it. That would be worth saying every day. And I resist the polarizing dynamics of our time, or being caught up, or contributing, or adding to.
So, what does Bowen theory contribute towards identifying one's right work?
Well, I mean, I think it's the kind of the focus. Boy, gotta think about that a little bit more. I mean, it's the focus on self in the best sense, right? And on I think differentiation means having appropriate boundaries. So in a sense, like it's one's right work, and so that's not my work. I think for people who are very anxious right now, to say, okay, don't get all caught up in everything that's going on, wherever you are on the spectrum, politically or theologically or whatever. Just pick, choose one thing. You don't even have to get it right. Choose something, take action, discern, assess. Say, is this mine to do? Is it still mine to do? It's a kind of an iterative process that is lifelong.
I think in
in faith community life in whatever form, a lot of times because of the dynamics that are present for many years, what clergy face is being told what your right work is. And the capacity to keep an eye on self, and also, I mean, part of the right work is caring for this community, but not at sacrificing self.
Right. And it is, it's tricky because, you're part of a larger system, so you've got to stay connected, the judicatory appropriately, and you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot, but there are times to take a stand about what your work is and what it isn't.
Yeah. I think that's both Margaret's quote and you, Margaret, how you understand that, I think is very helpful. You had said something to me on Monday about cynicism being an anxious response to situation, and we see a rise of cynicism also. And I just wonder if you have more thoughts to share with us.
I've thought about it a little bit since, that it is so thinking like cynicism. It's letting go of agency. So it's just the way it is. There's absolutely nothing I can do about it. The world is going to hell in a handbasket, or these people are impossible, or my bishop is shouldn't be a bishop, whatever, or the political situation, rather than saying, okay, here is this window of freedom that I have where I can act. I'm gonna do this. So I can't change the realities outside of my control, but I have agency here, and I can always, I can choose how I'm functioning. I can choose my attitude. I can decide to leave. I could change professions. I could take up a hobby. What are the many ways that I can act? I can find people to collaborate with that are interested in what I'm interested in. I think there's the cynical stance, there's the victim stance. I think there's some relation there, between they don't always show up in the same way, but where is the place where you have a choice, and what choices can you make on your own behalf?
Would you say that a leader's role is to create opportunities for agency for others, or only for self?
Well, I mean, you can always you primarily focus on self, but one way that you cultivate agency in others is by pushing responsibility toward them. Like the student that you were talking about. Well, you can figure it out.
Yeah. And then it's so interesting because the next day he said, "You're tough, Dr. Ott. You're really tough." Yeah. I said, "Thank you."
It's a compliment.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. If a professor in a seminary is not tough, they are not doing their job. Right. And if you think seminaries are, wait till you get in the parish. They're going to eat you alive.
I have said that too. But then you have students say, "Oh, I'm tired of you, professor, saying stuff like that." So, yeah. What do you see as key for our ministry leaders to stay strong and vibrant in this day and age? Reading The Economist, for one thing, but what else?
Read the scripture. Read the scripture, not just for the sermon. That's one thing that I would say.
Right.
So I would say, you focus on what you have control over, and keep it light. Have fun. I mean, I think if you do more of what you love in ministry, figure out what you love and do a little bit more of it, and just let go of the outcome as much as you can, and remember that it does not all depend on you. So.
Nice. Any other comments or questions? We haven't had a whole lot of action there. Just a couple things as we're closing down the final couple of minutes here. Our next conversations will be with John Engels, who is actually is a consultant in Rochester, New York, and does a lot of work with businesses. Also, John had spent some time in seminary and had prepared to be a priest at one time. So he has some interesting views on ministry and ministry life. So that'll be April 28th, and we'll have this online conversation with him as well. So our newsletter went out this week, folks, on I think on Monday or Tuesday, giving an overview of what we've got going. And I think that you won't want to miss Scotty Hargrove's presence with us on May 5th. You can register in person for our event here in Columbus. It's going to be at the Jewish Community Center here in Columbus. So would love to have you and invite other people as well. But also those of you who are on this conversation are already members of our network. So you can tap into that via livecast as part of your membership. All the goodies you get as a part of that. So just want to raise that up, and please and spread the word with other people. Pass the newsletter on to others as well. Also, right now I'm doing a lot of thinking about mergers, consolidations, and cooperative ministries. And partly that's because the seminary where I teach is now being merged into a larger university. So I'm doing a lot of thinking about my own functioning and also observing what's going on just broadly and locally. But I will be presenting what I observe and what I'm working on at the spring conference at the Bowen Center, and it's the title is Lions and Tigers and Mergers, oh my. So if you can come to the Bowen Center for that event, that's great, but we're also going to figure out a way to have that available for you through Healthy Congregations as well. So be watching for updates about that. And I think, Margaret, you had some things you wanted to share, some offerings that you have as well.
A couple of things, and I can think what I'll do is just send you the links, and you can send them out. But I have a free ministry toolkit with my favorite resources for ministry, and then also my social media for your church. It's a resource to help you get more thoughtful about your engagement on social media. And it's just half off of that resource. So I'll
That's great. You all get a deal here. So what Margaret and I are doing is we're exchanging resources here. So Margaret's making some things available to all of you, and then she is going to make some of Health Congregation's resources just not known within her network as well. So one of my goals when I assumed the executive directorship at Healthy Congregations was to build the relationships across all these people that are doing this kind of work, that we're going in the same direction, hopefully, so want to work together on this. So this is a part of that effort. Appreciate, Margaret, your time today and your thinking with us. Wonderful to have you with us. And I think we have some thank yous. People are writing thank yous, Margaret. You got me to have greater reflection, says Skip Armistead. So that's
you made my
great.
day.
We met.